I think because fundamentally a lot of what was being said about men in the sort of public discourse was fundamentally untrue, and I felt it was dishonest and sort of untrue to a lot of women's experience. So, you know, I come from a really loving family, and like my father is a really good man who's sort of gone out of his way to be, you know, like a sort of quiet but sort of successful and peaceful and generous guy who has lots of great virtues and values. You know, my brother's a good man, a good husband, a good father. I have lots of great male friends and a great male partner. And, you know, I just thought that there's a whole lot that's being not just missed out, but sort of active sort of demonization of men, right? That was sort of creeping up in the culture and in the sort of liberal discourse around men. And I just sort of thought, well, it's just not true, you know, and actually fundamentally men and women have to get along. You know, we do get along most of the time. And the background is also this kind of erosion of difference between men and women, you know, like the sort of weird idea that you can't say that men and women are different. I think there's been a lot of pushback against that in the last few years, but I think it was becoming really weird for both men and women, the idea that like sex isn't real, or if it is, you're not allowed to talk about it, because it is. And I think the men and women are, you know, profoundly different, but that doesn't mean that we're not compatible or complementary. And in fact, I think we sort of have to be, because we all live in the world together. So yeah, those were the sort of two main motives, I guess.
Well, I like the structure because as well, you seemed a lot more earnest and inquisitive. You weren't just asking men what they wanted. You were examining the reason for the contempt in the zeitgeist, and also saying, well, we need to allow men to come up with their own solutions quite a bit. Because what I've noticed recently, and we were speaking about this on the podcast yesterday, is that it feels like a lot of the time men can only have their issues enter public consciousness when parceled through the progressive filter if they want to be published in mainstream platforms. Like Christine Ember, for example, she's become a lot more sympathetic, but in her recent article on it, she was citing Mitt Romney and Barack Obama as potential icons of masculinity, and she was lumping Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate in the same box, and it's these presuppositions which soften the blow of saying, actually, our demonization of men for the last 10 years might have caused some of them to be miserable and depressed, that allows it to be acceptable and palatable. But they often say, well, we can diagnose a problem, but we can't provide solutions. And what I actually really liked was your humility to say, I don't presume to know any solutions because I actually understand the ambiguous complementarity means I'm prohibited from it. But yeah. I do have a stake in wanting men to succeed.
Yeah, no, completely. I think that's right. And, you know, part of my motivation also was the fact of knowing like three of my male friends. I talk about this in the chapter on male suicide, you know, committed suicide. And I think is also coming to terms with that. You know, the stats around male depression and male suicide are just horrific, right? And it's like none of us as human beings should want to live in a culture or a world in which that's true. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So we all have a stake in helping each other and trying to work out what's going on, such that there are these sort of deaths of despair, and, you know, whether it's to do with class, whether it's to do with purpose, whether it's to do with value, you know, changes in the type of society and the economy we have, where women seem to, you know, succeed better because now we're sort of post-industrial and it's all kind of knowledge-based and language and all those things that women are sort of better at. But, you know, I don't think a world that's like governed by women is better than the world that's governed by men. It's going to be worse in different ways, you know, and the kind of damage that women do, it has a different quality than the damage that men do. So I think, again, there has to be some of this complex, ambiguous game, and the title of the book is like, what do men want? But it's obviously a joke, right? Yes. Because like I can't answer that question, and it's also a joke about Freud, because yes. Freud famously says, or infamously says, what does women want? Like, I don't know. Yeah. You know, so it was like, well, what do men want? I don't know. So I do have a jokey list at the beginning where I actually got my male friends to answer like with a one-word answer, and so they said things like beer, a pussy, a shed.
Nigella Lawson.
Yeah.
At least you got the good taste, you know.
No, exactly. So it's like, you know, so there is an answer, like there's a little list. But yeah, of course, I think this question of humility is also about a sort of reverence for difference, you know, like, so I think this frisson of difference and the playfulness between the sexes is also something that's kind of been eroded as men and women are sort of forced into a kind of proximity through our culture, through our economy, where we're all sort of doing the same jobs. And, you know, I was remembering the other day, like, you know, the dating apps. So originally there was only Grindr, which is obviously for gay men. And before they brought in heterosexual dating apps, there were all of these articles in the newspapers saying, oh, this will never work for heterosexual women because women have a completely different attitude towards sex and dating than gay men do. And they're never going to go for these apps, which basically make all sexuality like gay male sexuality.
Yes.
And then sort of 10 years later, here we are, right? Like you have this incredibly depressing situation where like the apps are not working for anyone. Like I've spoken to women who've like, they're just sort of devastated by them, really, you know, because I do think that our sexuality is different. And I think this trying to force everyone or make everyone perform in the same way and think that, oh, we all have to have sex, meaningless sex all the time is actually like incredibly destructive and erodes our character. But it's sort of really indicative of the fact that men and women are like basically being treated the same and all of their differences are just sort of being railroaded and eroded, which I think harms both men and women, right?
Yeah, well, if you treat them as just unisex, fungible consumer units, then the emotions no longer matter. It's just you meet someone to bump bits with for instant gratification. It's like, well, that seems quite soulless to me.
Well, it's like ordering a pizza or something.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit of a disconcerting image. I mean, but they were right in a way of prophesizing that the hookup apps for gay men wouldn't map onto heterosexuality because they haven't. Like for a period of time, they were hookup apps, but there was a Pareto distribution principle of the men that were getting matches and then following through and then sleeping with the women. Whereas I think it was OkCupid that released this data that said women rated 80% of men as below average attractiveness. And just looking at the numbers, you know, 80% are not below average. That's nearly impossible. So there's some sort of perverse incentive there, misskewing the standards that are being applied, and it is leading to more and more women ending up lonelier and more men feeling that like they can't compete against the world for the attention of a woman they want. So, yeah, no, I really agree with how it's perversely set up. And maybe I wanted to tailor then into some of the structure of the book, because speaking of the sort of unisex liquidation, little birdie told me that you were Illich pilled, direct quote. and so when I was flicking through, I was surprised that the only reference to Illich was to tools of conviviality. Which was his definition of austerity, if I'm remembering correctly, which I haven't read, but I need to get through his library. And I did see quite a few sections of the book that sounded like they were tapping at some of his conclusions in gender. Just for the sake of the audience, you did put, the modern individual is in many ways a neutral de-sexed being. The differences between us are papered over. In most contemporary workspaces, it doesn't matter if a man or a woman does the job, although men still dominate the most perilous occupations. And it doesn't matter if a consumer is male or female, except if you're trying to sell them something branded, usually unnecessary as masculine and feminine. I think we need to start returning to thinking about men and women in terms of sex rather than gender, where the latter is a stand-in for how people would like to be perceived by others. So my question then is, you've assessed the pressures of knowledge economy work, like de-sexing us, but then it sounds very different to what Illich is saying via vernacular gender. What do you think about that?
Yeah, okay, so the reason why I did that, I am Illich pilled, to use that language, but I didn't want to sort of write a book about Illich, right? Yes. So, no, I mean, the fact that I think many of the same things with or without Illich is sort of like, that's what's sort of at stake for me. The reason why I don't use gender in the way that Illich uses it is because that term has become so confused, and you know there are at least two ways it's being used, one of which was like the second wave feminist way, where gender is a kind of social expectation that's kind of mapped onto sex, right? So the idea that if you're a girl or a boy, you must behave in these particular ways.
Yes. And
that's how we understood gender from that period. It was also taken from somebody like John Money, who's a really evil sexologist of the late 60s, you know, and we could say it was a bad move, right, to use this term for anybody. Since then, however, gender has also become something slightly different, which is this like inner feeling, which somehow is more important than sex, right? And that's what's undergirding the kind of transgender movement and genderism as a contemporary ideology. Illich, in his book Gender from 1982, which he was cancelled for, to use our contemporary parlance, by a lot of feminists because they saw it as reactionary and traditionalist, uses gender in a third sense, right, which is to do, like you say, with kind of separate spheres and tool use and traditions. and almost like a tacit understanding that men and women had different roles, so to the extent that we wouldn't even talk about it, right? And he talks about that as vernacular, everyday gender. And then he talks about economic sex as being an invention of modernity. The reason why I didn't want to follow Illich's use of gender and sex in that way is because the other battle we're fighting at the moment is to say, no, sexual difference is real and meaningful. So as a contribution to that discussion, and obviously, like, I'm gender critical, I've been denounced millions of times as transphobic, a TERF and all of that, and I've been cancelled on that point for many years. But like the truth. So I wanted to reclaim sex in the current discussion, as many of us do, because we want to say, look, human beings are sexed. There are two sexes, you know, sex matters in some circumstances. Men and women are different, and it's beautiful that they are, and all of that sort of thing. So gender in that sense is not a very helpful term for us to use. Do you see what I mean? Because it's been corrupted to mean, you know, oh, whatever my feeling is about, you know, my who I am in the
personality,
world.
basically, yeah. It's fractionated with intersectionality down to the level of the individual back again. But then it's in a way which stratifies us rather than allowing us to build communities that give us some sort of sex solidarity. No, I'll take your point. We need to rebuild some kind of embodied foundation before we can start negotiating norms again. Yeah, but sort of wrapping back around to what we'd said before, this is actually the problem of tech and the industrial and sexual revolutions and the digital revolution and displacement, is that both gender in terms of custom specific to time and place, and now embodied sex, thanks to swapping bits due to tech, have just been liquidated. And so it's not particularly shocking that we're no longer as attracted to each other or able to form relationships and the like again.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.